officially recording. So I'm going to go through a couple of survey examples and we can apply some of the concepts that were in the first two lectures about surveys in these examples. So the big survey examples for criminal justice research in general are those that are counting crime. So asking people about their victimization, if they've ever been victimized by crime. And this was really important when we were developing criminal justice in the beginning, because a lot of people were just relying on police data for crime. And we know that not all crime is reported, not all crime is observed by police or by someone else. So these victimization surveys were really, really important to have researchers realize that there's whole slews of crime that is committed a part of the dark figure of crime that we're not aware of. Then there's other, the self-report surveys also help in that identifying crime and understanding people who commit crimes that don't get caught. And there's some difficulty because sometimes people aren't as willing to say that they have committed crimes, but there were developments that actually researchers were surprised when they did self-report surveys about the amount in which people do disclose how much crime they've committed. And so the bigger self-report surveys are the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. So it's based on a national sample of households. It's been conducted for a while, since the 70s, and it talks about sort of drug use and lifetime use and residential areas. And so this is really helpful if you're interested in like drug rehabilitation and drug use. It's a national database, and if you're interested, after this lecture, I can show you all how to access that data, as well as the other ones I'm going to talk about. So there's the Monitoring the Future report, and this really was the first self-report survey that had researchers thinking about how people may not be, like how people commit crimes and may not be caught. So like lower level crimes, in particular with like high schoolers, how that might influence the crime rate. And there's victimization surveys, and the big ones are the National Crime Victimization Survey. And this is done by the census. So it actually is a longitudinal study. So longitudinal means that we see it over time. We have snapshots of those instances of research and those observations. And so the households are the same each year for 3 years. And so you can sort of see how crime victimization impacts people over time. And it's more of that impact than measuring crime, because there's the panel aspect to it. And then there's the Community Victimization Survey, which was developed in the 60s. And actually, I believe it first started in Chicago, but I'm not completely sure. But it was also done by the Census Bureau. So Census is like a really big resource for social science research. A lot of the data we get is from the census. I also am working on census data that's from like government financial records. Those also have to get reported to the census. So the census website is a really good resource. I would highly recommend it. Alrighty, then there's the General Social Survey, which has been administered since the 70s. And it was started at the University of Chicago, and it has a bunch of, if you're interested on people's opinions about politics, religion, policies, like whether or not the US is effective in reducing crime, that's a question on the General Social Survey. So if you Google the General Social Survey, you can get a whole list of the questions that they have, and I can pull that up after this lecture as well. And they use computer assisted phone interviews, which was talked about in the second lecture for this week, is a way of administering survey. So after you've sort of created the format of the survey and the questions that you're asking, they hire a bunch of people to call people on the phone to participate in the survey. And the questions, although the questions they ask, like they literally have hundreds of questions on attitudes about religion and politics and policy, but not everyone who gets the survey gets all of those questions. So each survey is different, and each telephone interview, there's like certain people who get asked one format and then other people who get asked other formats, and certain questions each year either get added or taken off. So it's a consistent survey that's been done multiple times, like is getting multiple snapshots throughout time, but the questions themselves are sort of changing and some of the questions are consistent. So you can utilize that data source to do an analysis of like over the years how people's attitudes change on a particular question, which would be a cool research project. And so they've talked about probability sampling, and jump in if you all have questions, like really do type in the chat or ask audibly. But probability sampling ensures that the larger population we're interested in, that we're getting an equal probability to get those people in our sampling frame. And then we can make sort of causal claims about opinions, right? So the way that they do it is a multi-stage cluster. So they will identify sectors of the US population and then pull from those. I think they do it geographically. And so the larger the sampling frame for this is US population in general. And so that's how they develop the smaller sample that they actually get. And Berkeley has a user-friendly way to explore the data online. Any questions thus far on the crime victimization or the general social survey? Okay, I'll move on to the census. So as we talked about, the census does a lot of data collection. In addition to just there's annual censuses that occur. And then there's also the census, which actually means like every 10 years, I believe. So every 10 years it's done. And so you can remember that by the name. And it's actually in our Constitution that it has to be done. It's like a constitutional provision. And so it's part of a large responsibility of the government is to understand, okay, what is the US population? What are demographic areas that we should be aware of? So it collects social, economic, and geographic data. And there's hard to count populations, which we'll get into, which are a good example of selection that can happen in sampling. So ideally, we would like to get all of the population. The census is trying to get the larger sampling frame is the entire US population, but we know that there may be variables that influence whether or not people can take the survey. And we'll get into what those variables are. So this past year, it's done every 10 years. So this past year in 2020, it was the first time that they had an online version of it and that it was administered online. Usually they did forms. And the census is also really important for policy because it helps determine how the state's congressional districts. So every 10 years, there will be a whole committee, legislative committee, I believe they call it, that determines how many congressional districts each of the states get. So it determines how many representatives you have for your state and sort of the districting map of that state. And it also allocates resources. So a lot of times the federal government will do pass through of funding to state governments for national programs like SNAP or Social Security, and all of these programs that the federal government gives to the states so they can implement. So a lot of funding comes from these numbers, and a lot of social research comes from these numbers too. So these are the hard to count communities, which the census has been going on for so long that they've identified certain variables that impact whether or not people can actually take the survey. So these are people that are identified as hard to count. So usually immigrants, people of color, urban residents, children under 5, people living in multifamily housing, English as second language, and people without consistent housing. And the reason this happens is, one, people without consistent housing or people living in multifamily homes, the way that the multi-stage sampling occurs is geographical, right? So, and it's based on housing. So because we're basing how we're sampling our population on housing, then those people who, like, for example, I live in a 3-unit apartment, it would be harder to count all of us because of the multifamily housing that occurs. You may just get one person in that housing. And then even further, some people, like multiple people, live in an area and are sharing just a bedroom in a common living space, but they're individuals that are separate and not family. So these are aspects that complicate survey administration. And things like English as a second language, immigrants, people of color, and urban residents are demographically hard to count because of like lack of access to the survey and the language that's provided. So the census has done a really good job about making sure that the form is in all of the languages that people can speak in the US. But there's also issues with access to internet or other things like that that may make it harder to count people. And just like how families live too. Like I feel like a lot of immigrants, there's like multiple generations living in the same area. So sometimes they might be undercounted because only one person's filling out the form rather than the entire household. And this map over here shows you the hard to count areas, which, as you can see, are sort of correlated to where cities are. So you see up there Trenton in red in Mercer County, and then Hudson County, you have Newark, and all of those other areas, Elizabeth and Essex as well. So New Jersey's stats. This is a good way to understand response rates. So remember, response rates are, you have administered the survey to a bunch of people, you've sent it to them via email, or you've sent them a mailing. So for the US Census this past year, there were people who came to people's stores in like hard to count areas and asked them to fill out the survey online or provided a hard copy. And then there's also people who may have called you to fill out the census, and there's also people who may have sent you something via online or whatnot. And so the return rates depend on whether or not people actually fill out the form, because you may give someone the opportunity to fill out the form, but they do not, right? For whatever reason, people are busy, they need good incentive to fill it out and whatnot. And so the response rates for cities are particularly low, and that's part of why hard to count areas include urban populations. So they range from 50 to 60%. I think the national average is 69% or 65%, so it's much lower. And these percentages, even though like they may seem small, like I'm saying they're much lower, but you're like, oh, it's only like 10%. Like that makes a large difference because we're talking about the entire US population. So those percentages are actually, like, in raw data, a lot of people. So in 2015, the state received $17.56 billion in federal grants, which is half of the entire state budget. And those numbers the amount that's allocated are determined based off of the number of people that would be eligible for those specific programs and whatnot. So they depend on the census from prior. And this past go around, there was a citizenship question, which may have created barriers for hard to count demographics, because some people may have been risk averse, not wanting to fill it out because they didn't want people to know about their undocumented status or whatnot. So it ultimately didn't end up on the census, but that doesn't mean that the impact and news coverage of it didn't make people wary of wanting to fill it out in general. So we'll see, currently there are no stats yet on the demographics of hard to count people and whether or not they actually filled it out, but we'll see those and how they come out in the coming year or so. So New Jersey did a pretty good job at response rates. Like, the results show that in all but 3 counties, we were above the 2010 response rate. And the self-response rate increased from 2% from the 2010 census. So that's also a good sign. And so this sort of shows you how response rates are important to keep track of. There's probably serial numbers that the census is utilized to keep track of who is filling in the census. So which counties were below? It's the 2 southern counties. I'm sorry, I'm not from New Jersey, but it's like the southern end of New Jersey were below. And after this lecture, I can actually pull up the map and we can look at it. There's an interactive map that is provided online, where you can actually look at counties too, and smaller census districts as well. So does anyone have any questions about the census? Nope, alrighty. So now we're gonna move on to the annual survey of jails. I'm actually working on this data set, so I know a good amount about it. So if you have questions about it, I can answer. So every year, there is an annual survey in which the government surveys correctional administrators and gives them a form to fill out about their jail and their jail population. So like how many correctional officers there are, what their budget is, the count of people who are in jail and what their demographics are, whether or not they've been convicted or not. And this has been happening since 1982. And they are doing a stratified probability sampling method. So again, this is nationally representative. So the entire sampling frame is all jails throughout the US. And so what they do is they subdivide, stratifying is subdividing into smaller units. So they make sure to get the largest population jails, and then they also get and divide the jails that are within states based off of the amount of people that are in them. And so it also uses, there's this, similar to the regular census, there's a census of jails where their sampling frame is the entire jail population. And so the annual survey of jails uses that as its sampling frame, its probability frame, and creates a list of those jails, and then it'll sample off of those. And Vera Institute also has a really great visual of these stats where you can look at the national map and look at like how many people are jailed in your area and whatnot. So we can also look at that after the lecture as well. So these are really important and helpful surveys for criminal justice because it allows us to understand the trends in incarceration. So as we see in these figures, we have that there are way more unconvicted people in jail than there are convicted people in jail, which obviously is an issue because our criminal justice system is very slow moving. And then there's also a sense of like, okay, how have the amount of people in jail increased or decreased over time? So based off of these figures, is there anything that surprises you or that you think is interesting? Alrighty. I mean, I think there's definitely a massive racial gap that we see. And it's interesting that the Hispanic population has sort of stayed consistent over time as well.
I was looking at that, Professor, and I had thought that I had expected it to be non-Hispanic Black would be higher.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering jail population.
So that's a great point, because in actuality, this jail population is number, right? It's not proportion. It's not the rate of incarceration. So if instead we adjusted this to be like the rate of incarceration for that demographic within the state, we might see more inequality. But we see here that like, that's why this graph is sort of deceptive too, is because there are generally more white people in the country. So it would make sense that they're also incarcerated at higher rates. So it's just the jail population. So it's really important when you're looking at figures to say, okay, let's look at the left and it's the jail population. It's not the jail population per 100,000 people or anything like that. It's not a rate. It's instead just the raw data and the raw numbers.
I was also looking at that. I was actually trying to compare to a seminar I had just a few hours ago, which the numbers are flipped, totally different. And I guess when you present ratios, when you do as a per the ratio to the total population of the jail, it would be, I guess, I don't know, but these raw don't match anything that I've heard previously. The way it's reported, it's the population in jails are primarily African American, but I guess when you look at the ratio of numbers, I guess that's how they present it. It's totally different. I was actually trying to see if I had captured that chart because it's a little different. It's a lot different.
Yeah, so this is really important for us to think about. It brings us back to like the first couple of weeks where we talked about the types of variables, and we have ordinal and nominal and interval. So this is an interval variable, right? It's the raw data, the raw numbers, but it's not a rate. And especially when we're looking at demographics, we want to be looking at rates because otherwise we're not really getting a sense of the proportion of people being incarcerated. We're just getting the raw numbers. And this also is like the entire US population. So it's just a raw data of the entire jail population. So we're also not getting a sense of how this might be different in different areas. I know within New Jersey, we're like one of the worst in regards to inequality in race and incarceration. So there are other numbers, and I actually can show, I think the Sentencing Project has a really good visual for that incorporates rates instead of just raw data. And if we think about it closely, this is part of the census of jail. So this is a government report. And so this is how the government is reporting it. And obviously the government has its own audience that it's trying to impact. And so it's also helpful when you're looking at graphs to think about who's the one pushing these specific graphs and sort of what their incentive structures are like. And so these are rates instead. And so we see in comparison, when we look at this, it's much, much more clear inequality in regards to rates. So we see here, which is what you all said, that there's a much higher rate for Black and Hispanic and white are relatively the same. And then we can look over time how these rates have changed. And we see that women's incarceration has sort of increased a little bit, sort of went down and then increased. And then we also see that American Indian and Alaska Native has a disproportionate amount of people incarcerated. So if there are no questions on this, we can move on to sort of see what the form looks like actually for this survey. So this is the format and structure that gets sent to administrators. So it's very I think it's sort of clunky, but it's interesting because it's like they're thinking about the audience. And so traditionally when we are trying to promote a survey that's about opinions or that's towards a specific population, we're trying to do it in a way that is easily accessible, that looks nice, that is provides visual incentives for people to fill out. But because this is an administrative survey, we sort of see how clunky it is. And because people are required to sort of fill this out as part of their jobs and their responsibilities as being administrators of correctional facilities, we see like how much technical jargon there really is in these. And that's another note that we should think about in regards to jail incarceration, is that there's a lot of churning and cycle. So these are based off of annual daily populations, not the entirety of everyone who's gone through that specific jail in that specific year. So that's also a limitation of the survey. So as you see in the form, for example, question 4, on June 30th, 2017, how many persons were confined? So June 30th may be like a seasonal area where it's like a lower time, or maybe it's a higher time. So something that the survey also needs to consider is seasonality that may occur based off of the date they're picking. So I'm assuming that they picked June 30th because it's the summer and like supposedly crime is higher in the summer. And so maybe that's why they picked that particular date. Yeah, or the midpoint of the year. Any other questions about this? And I've pulled all of this from so each survey or data that we've referenced here has what we call a code book. And the code book has how they did the survey, what their methods were, and usually also has the form that the survey was done. This survey is performed annually. Alrighty, any questions on any of the survey examples we went through? We're sort of gonna shift and I'm gonna stop the recording and go into how you can get access to all of this data. No, alrighty. So how do I find this data? I've sort of talked about this already, but the ICPSR website is a really good resource. I'll pull it up on my computer and share my screen so you all can see it, but it's a lot of the data that I've analyzed and downloaded has been from that website, and it has a bunch of national, all of the census data that we're talking about on there. And because you're a Rutgers student, you get access to that data. You want to identify the code book before you analyze or play with any of the variables in the data, which, like I said, it's sort of a manual of how the survey was collected, how it was coded and documented. And then it's really important, in the method section of the code book, there will often they'll tell you exactly like multi-stage cluster sample. They'll tell you exactly how they're sampling. And so you can look at that after having taken this class and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of their sampling method. And it's good to have the code book, but it's also good to have an idea and a sense of like on the ground, how does this actually get administrated? Like some questions I would have about the annual survey would be like, is it a space in which the sort of attorney general is telling each of these jail administrators to fill it out? Or is it a space in which the federal government contacts them and then they have to fill it out? And so those are things you sort of want to think about as you're analyzing the data, because there may be different forms of incentive that create selection where some people are more likely to fill it out than others. Alrighty, so I'm going to end this recording.